Hey, I'm Jess.
And I'm Ryan, and you're listening to Your Therapist is Not Okay.
Today's episode, we are going to be answering the question, why don't therapists give advice?
This links with a previous episode where we were talking about advice with friends versus clients, and Jess had shared that she would freely give her friends advice, but that wouldn't be a thing with clients. So today we're kind of going to grapple with why, and why is that such a big and important thing for therapists to not give advice?
Mhm. So, when it comes to advice giving with clients, any therapist listening to this will know it's a pretty huge taboo. We do not give advice to our clients. But I'm curious why it's such a no-go in therapy. Like, especially when you were linking with what I was saying in previous episode about, yeah, I'll give my friends advice, no problem. They should do what I tell them. I am brilliant. But I won't I won't necessarily do it with my clients. What's your take on this? Why would it be a no-go in therapy?
We'll have to figure out the explanation there because your brilliance carries through whether you're a friend or a therapist. So it can't be about the brilliance dimming. Um, I think for me, it's interesting to reflect on that, the kind of idea of it being a taboo. Because you're
Mm,
right, amongst therapists, it is something that we will hear over and over again. Therapists don't do. It's something we might hear over and over again from clients that, like, will you just tell me X, Y, and Z? Um, it's a kind of a reversal from the norm in everyday life. The norm in everyday life is often if you're talking about something you're struggling with a friend or family member, they're likely to give you some advice. It might not be like really big, overreaching kind of advice, or it might be, depending on kind of the boundaries that you have with your friends and family. Some people might, whether asked or not asked, feel like they want to give a lot of input, like, I think you should do this, I think you should do that. Have you tried? Have you tried going for a walk? Have you tried changing your diet? Like, people will give you all kinds of suggestions, whether it's about health or mental health or how to find a new apartment to rent. People are full of advice for all kinds of things. And I would also kind of link this with our episode talking about whether or not we can be friends with clients, whether or not that's a safe thing to do. And if you listen to that, we were pretty clear that that doesn't work for a lot of reasons, but one of the big reasons is that therapists offer kind of a different kind of listening and a different presence from friends. So one thing that helps me think about this as a therapist is if this client is bringing this thing to me, they've listened to all the different advice that their friends had to give. I'm probably not going to imagine something vastly different. That advice hasn't helped. So it's not my job to come up with bigger, better advice.
mm,
It's my job to listen and help the client to attune to how they want to solve this situation in a way that really works for them.
mm,
So for me, it's really also in a way I don't want to steal my clients' kind of aha moment and figuring it out for themselves. I don't want to kind of predetermine the quote right solution for them because what might be right for me in that kind of situation very much might not be right for my client or anyone else. And I think helping them to arrive at that is far more powerful for the client.
hmm. I think when you're saying that, a couple of things kind of come through my mind. One is myself as a client. Oh, so many times I'm like, I don't need your sage probing questions. I want you to tell me why my life is a dumpster fire and help me. And
We'll
so
cut to footage of Jess throwing matches in the dumpster.
me and the raccoons were tormenting Toronto. Um, and so I think that like it's actually a really good question. There's sometimes where I'm like, just tell me what you see. Just from your perspective, tell me what's going on in your mind. And which is not quite advice, but it's almost like, give me the real stuff. Stop just trying to like have me be a better person with my questions. Um, so I have real empathy for clients. The other thing I was thinking about is if I take my example of giving my friends advice seriously, you're absolutely correct, Ryan. How many times do my friends take my advice? And I am looking at you right now.
My first response was more than they should.
Like, how many times have I been like, Ryan, here's what I'm seeing. Like, this is what I would do. And you're like, great, that's wonderful. Not gonna do it.
Absolutely. Yes. And I think, we experience that all the time in friend relationships where we know like they're gonna do their own thing anyway. Yeah, for sure.
Hmm.
Um, but I guess what that kind of like gives some kind of credence to is like that advice doesn't really do anything that deep usually.
Hmm.
So it's not going to do that much for our clients probably if we were to switch over to that.
And there's something dangerous sometimes with advice in some ways. Like,
Mm.
so you know those friends that are like, oh, I was once in your position and here's what I did. It almost makes it feel like you're behind them. Like the advice itself of being like, here's how I got out of it, as if somehow like you haven't figured out everything that they have, can be almost weirdly demeaning in some ways.
Absolutely. And I think that's a part of that. Like, we have this ethic of wanting to level the power dynamic in therapy. Most therapists have that. We very explicitly have that, Jess and I. Um, And oftentimes advice is kind of a very intentional, exactly like you're saying. It's like saying like, "Oh, I have something to offer you, poor little thing. If
Mhm.
only you knew what I knew."
Yeah.
Um, you know, and I do want to caveat it's almost always done out of love and good intentions. But I think in giving advice, people sometimes get this little ego boost of like, "Oh yeah, I know what I'm talking about. I've figured this out."
Yeah.
But it can, exactly like you're saying that, yeah, it does something in the relationship then where the person's like, oh, I feel bad that I hadn't figured it out yet, or oh, I'm so behind. Well, I'm kind of curious, talking here about advice in general and in friendship relationships, and I'm kind of curious then what goes through your head, Jess, when a client asks for, or even like we're saying, like when we as clients or our clients are like, just please tell me the answer, really insisting. And then what do you say?
I mean, the first thing is I get it. Like, as I said before, I think in some ways, like when a client really wants to know if that feels like part of the work, we might actually explore that.
Hmm.
Like, what does it feel right now for you to be so alone and actually just wanting someone to solve this? We had that episode where we talked about can we fix you? I think advice and fixing kind of go hand in hand in that kind of way.
Hmm.
Well, one of the reasons like that I might explain to somebody or even like supervisees who might also be asking me this question is one of the coolest things about doing this work is that I actually have no idea what someone's going to do, what their answers are going to be to certain questions, and even what's right for them to do. It's not uncommon for if I have an idea in my head of a place that we can go in therapy, for me to ask the client and them to go to such a deeper, more meaningful thing than even I had picked out because they have so much more context and interconnections in their own life that me asking this question openly opens up doors that I didn't even know we could walk through. And I think that's the same with what they should do. Like walking somebody through what I think would only come from my limited hearing of one side of the story, theirs, and from my narrow perspective on who they are, which is just from my own kind of vantage point. So in that way, it is actually kind of limited for me to give them any kind of personal advice that would do something that they couldn't do themselves.
Hmm.
Linking back to what you said about the fact that we can't really come up with this incredible, impressive piece of advice that they probably either haven't thought about before or that their friends haven't told them.
Yeah.
And so, in that way, I think that it's really not going to be that interesting if I give someone advice. And also, then there's a couple hidden things that I think go through my mind. One is autonomy. A lot of times, the people who ask me to just tell them, or just, can you tell me what to do? Like, what should I do? Should I date this person? Should I quit this job? Like, whatever the example is. They usually have had a history of their lives or their past lives of being told what to do, of having very influential or powerful parents that have kind of dictated parts of their life. They might be even in a career because they want to impress their parents. They might be in a relationship because this person reminds them of a domineering parent in the past. So it's not uncommon to have a client wanting advice that actually probably hasn't done a lot of free thinking because they haven't been afforded that. So
Mm.
by giving advice, I'd be falling into the same old patterns of like, this is what you should do. And so by allowing them to actually start to come up with their own ideas of what would be best for them is change in and of itself of that very decision making.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And a couple of things were going through my head as you were talking about that. One is just kind of like visualizing this conversation or exploration in space. So like if you imagine there's like you're in a nature area and there's 1,000 different trails you could take, us giving advice would be kind of like saying like actually there's only one trail.
Mm,
Instead of allowing that kind of wonder of like what are we going to stumble on? What
mm,
secret route that leads to a different destination even are you
mm.
going to find that's so uniquely you?
I like that.
Yeah. And then the other thing that I'm kind of thinking is that request for advice. I sometimes really hear it as wanting to avoid some really painful or difficult stuff,
Okay.
wanting to kind of get out of this bad feeling. Because it's often that, like, I'm in a lot of pain, tell me how to fix it. It allows us to just like bounce off that pain and keep going as kind of imagining that we can then just like skip into this blissful future. When a lot of the times what I find is clients that, kind of repeat these same challenges over and over again in their life, it's because we're not fully arriving at the depth of pain or, fear or difficulty that comes with those certain topics that it's just like, oh, you have to really arrive at something before you can leave it. Sounds like a cheesy adage or something, but I do find that it rings true for people who are kind of reprocessing that thing over and over again. That eventually it's like, yeah, let's talk about what you want to do next and how hard it is to be here, but let's be here first.
Yeah. Like that aspect of the grist for the mill. It's like sometimes when we think about therapy, we think the advice or the aha moment is the most important part in therapy. Actually, it's this part. What brings us back to the same pattern? What
Mm,
brings us back to constantly not going into the darkness? That thing itself is so part of the work and can be actually as deep and as meaningful than whatever happens when we move past it or we start to kind of solve it. Like finding out what all of the interconnections are between what keeps us stuck, why we keep coming back to the same pattern. What
mm,
was it from our past that kind of linked us into that? Or why do we avoid pain? All of these kinds of things that are really in the messiness of the thing itself is way more important than the pat advice. I'm thinking about the aspect of giving someone a hug often is more for the hugger than the person getting the hug because we often are trying to soothe something that's painful and it can make us feel like we're doing something.
mm. That's a brilliant analogy, right? Like it can feel like, oh, I'm doing something in the face of this pain or hopelessness. Yeah, absolutely. It's like I want to give you a hug. And
Mhm.
it's I feel better. I did something about your grief and now I can go home.
Yeah.
When it can even be really a way of saying like, shut up, I don't want to hear about it anymore.
Yeah.
I think of advice can even more often than hugs can come off with that kind of condescending, like, don't you realize you just need to whatever?
Yeah, exactly. And also kind of cheeky. I think sometimes clients just want to blame us.
Oh yeah.
Like that aspect of like, well, Jess, you told me to, and it didn't work out. And
Hmm.
I'm not gonna lie, sometimes that happens to me. I'm like, I didn't do anything.
Oh yeah, any therapist that's listening can probably relate to that feeling of a client coming in and saying, "Well, last time I was here, you told me to do this," and inside I'm thinking, "No, I did not tell you to do
You didn't, how
that."
did you get that from that? Yeah. So as a cheeky thing, sometimes I'm like, there could be an aspect of wanting to kind of let go of that responsibility. And it
Mm,
can all link in together. If you've often had someone else take responsibility for your actions or kind of have often had a passive role in your own life, taking that control can actually feel quite scary. So, yeah.
absolutely. Let's talk about where this might feel like a little extra complicated for us. Kind of
Mm.
thinking about like, do we ever break this no advice rule? Is it ever hard for us to hold back some advice?
Uh-huh.
Um, I'm kind of thinking about some of those struggles I have in myself, that I think about being almost like kind of towing the line between psychoeducation and advice, right? Where there's like something that I want my client to know about the way human minds function or the way a psychological illness kind of presents, or what trauma does to us mentally and bodily, things like that.
Mm.
Where in giving the advice, it can almost sound like, or in a way, be maybe I'm masking some advice that I actually want to give, that I'm kind of trying to lead them down this, consider this. Um, so I try really hard to frame that and be clear with clients. Like this is just some information that you can use any way you want to.
I could see you trying to then check in with yourself, being like, is this information that they can use anytime they want to? Or is this me subtly telling them this is the information they should use right now in this particular situation so that they get out of this thing?
Right. And with as therapists, like one thing to know about us, I don't know if we really mentioned this, but like there's often like there's a million things running through our head about the session that we're kind of keeping track of how the client is doing, where is the window of tolerance. Like we've got a lot of things running through our heads at the same time. Sometimes I almost imagine that there's like a drop down menu of like Ryan's next possible questions. One important thing that I train new therapists on too is like, how do I move away from just be as present as possible and not so focused on the what's next drop down questions. But we do still kind of have this integrated part that's like almost watching us have the session to help guide us for how to be as supportive as possible.
Mhm.
So there might be a lot of times when I would say like now is not the moment that I'm going to do the psychoeducation because I might feel like a little heavy-handed or a little too like this is what you should do. Instead, I would often choose to use that as a way to maybe normalize or acknowledge an experience. When a client's saying like I feel like maybe I feel like I'm crazy because like I'm always like looking over my shoulder. And then it's to kind of normalize that, I can say like actually that's something that happens to our nervous system when we've experienced this kind of trauma, that we're going to be scanning our environment for threats and risk.
Yep.
And that's something that I've seen time and time again. So it has that psychoeducation to normalize rather than like, if clients do this, then this will happen, is maybe more like advice forward.
Okay. And it's actually not quite our topic, but it really thought about when I have to watch videos for my students at Centered Self of them practicing. One of the things that I let them know pretty clearly is that I won't be necessarily judging what you're doing in terms of what question you chose. Because unless you're in a session as therapist with client, you really are missing some of that affect. Like watching something on a screen is so different from being in the space. And I sometimes have this moment when I'm with a client and I ask a question thinking that's probably outside of the scope of what someone else might have thought to ask. But it's all of those things that are going through our head. Um, or even feeling our own kind of um it might have the term I'm going to use is projection. And what projection could mean in this instance is a client really wants something from me, and so I start to feel the pull to solve something for them.
Hmm.
And so that would be an example of projection that I might feel in the space. Anyone watching that on a screen wouldn't see that. They wouldn't feel that. But I would feel it as a therapist with a client. And so I think that's sometimes where I can notice myself skirting the edge of no advice or that rule that we're kind of creating is that sometimes it actually psychically can happen in myself where I feel like I'm not giving enough to a client.
Hmm. Right. And there can be, yeah, that those kind of like felt senses or felt knowledges that we might talk about in psychodynamic therapy. Um, and some of that is also because like we're tracking along behind us all the history that we know about the client, all the work we've done together in the past, like all those things built up. For anyone that's feeling like, isn't that like a little bit too woo-woo? Maybe it's a little woo-woo for you, but not for you, for you listener, I mean. Um, and I don't think it is. I'm very woo-woo, so this is maybe just like a self-conscious caveat moment. Um, but it really is like it's just about us being steeped in this story, making connections and understanding. Like the client said this, but here I know from knowing them that this is maybe what it means for them. This is how it sinks and hits and sits with them.
Mm. And I'm also thinking about like, even if we do not give advice based on that kind of aspect of relationship that you're talking about, is I would be remiss to think that clients don't often hear unspoken advice.
Hmm.
Like, I could only imagine sometimes what my eyebrows are doing in session.
Oh, I know my eyebrows are working overtime. They've got their own salary. Like,
My goodness, I know. And so I could imagine like I've seen it with clients sometimes where like they'll be talking about something that like, what do you think? Or what are you thinking, Jess? Or there'll be a moment where I'm like, oh, we have some work to do here because you probably are internalizing advice that either I'm giving away with my face, and even if I'm not, that you know me enough to wonder about what I'm thinking. So
hmm.
if someone keeps making a very similar decision, for example, that they've been coming to me for, first of all, it can be really hard to tell me that they're continuing to do it because they fear the judgment. Or once they do tell me, they wonder what I'm thinking. Like if I'd be like, oh, you shouldn't do that, or like, why are we still doing that? This is what you should do. And I'll say right off the bat, Ryan, like, that's not what I'm thinking. It's
Yeah.
almost inevitably not, you shouldn't do this. It's more, we're back here again. Something continually is leading you here. And that's
Hmm.
where my mind is. Like, it's usually the why or what's leading us here, what's motivating. Something is still having power over you.
Hmm.
What's that thing that we haven't yet felt? Very rarely is it, don't do that. That advice is so far away from my mind in that kind of way. But a client might internalize that I want to give them advice in that moment.
Absolutely. I mean, this makes me think about, how difficult it might be to tell your therapist that you relapsed, maybe, whether
Yeah.
you relapsed with using a substance or going back into an unhealthy relationship or dynamic.
Yeah.
There can be so much shame in sharing that with anyone that you know was like really in your corner and wanting you to be safe and happy.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, exactly like you said, that's going to be the absolute last thing on my mind when you share that with me. It's not like, oh, how could you? That's in fact one of those different opportunities that's different than being a friend, right? A lot of friend or family members at the time would be like, I can't believe you did this again. You were finally doing so well, etc. We can offer that different perspective of like, okay, why
Mhm.
do you think that happened? How are you feeling about it now? Is anything different? And like kind of support them through that process in a way where we don't feel like their decision is about us or wounds us in any way, right? That can be a big part in that family dynamic of, I can't believe you're putting me through this again. Well, hold on. It's not about me. And as a therapist, it can really be not about us.
Mm. I think that's exactly it. Like, I wouldn't be remiss to say that, like, we definitely will have thoughts about what we would love for our clients.
Mm.
But I think that that is exactly the difference. If I tied in a full circle back to me saying that about my friends with advice and not clients, it's because with my friends, I won't be diving into their past.
Mm.
And I won't necessarily be linking, we're back here again. Let's look at like what's going on with this intricacy because that's not my role as a dear friend. My role is to actually have their back, to care for them, to love them, but also to not psychoanalyze them. Whereas in my role as a psychoanalyst, it is to kind of not necessarily give advice, but to be like, oh, we're back here again. Okay, let's grapple this together. You have not let me down. In fact, we just have some more work to do together. Let's keep
Mhm.
climbing this hill together. Let's keep doing this.
Yeah. And that can even be a special opportunity to celebrate them for sharing that.
Yeah.
Um, it's actually, I tend to make maybe even an obnoxious big deal out of it the first time a client disagrees with me.
Oh, okay,
New
go on.
client, and they're like, I don't think that's what's happening. I'm like, yeah, thank you. I'm learning from you. That's really helpful. Um, that just to kind of make sure clients know that they don't have to like go along with everything I say because maybe I'm wrong. Um, and they're gonna tell me something that will help me do better with them in the future. And I'm thinking about times when I might give what is almost maybe like a leading question, intentionally or unintentionally. And I think there's some like back of my mind caveat, similarly to what you were saying. Like when I ask that kind of question, I'm actually wondering, like, actually, really, why are we back here again? What's going on? What still has some power over you? I'm thinking about like a particular question that I've asked many clients that are having a relationship issue. And that they'll like talk for like 15, 20 minutes about like this is happening in this relationship. It's
Yep.
driving me crazy. I'm tracking, I'm nodding, I'm like I'm with them, I'm understanding and feeling some of what's going on in there. And then I ask them, have you talked to them about this at all? And part of that is really I'm wanting to explore like, if you haven't, why not? What's hard about that? Do you think that would be helpful? Do you feel a sense of mutuality in this relationship? Like, there's a million different things swirling around that, but a bold face right in front of all of that, it sounds like you have to talk to them.
Yep.
And
There
I
is
would be
advice
lying.
implicit. Yeah.
Yeah, I would be lying if I said sometimes that's not in there. That I'm like, yeah, what do you think is going to change?
Well, that's a really good point because actually that is where I would give advice.
Hmm.
If I have a client that's like something's holding them back with a partner, usually if I have a good enough relationship, we'll also look at how that flips back onto them. Like
Yeah.
what, like let's clean our own side of our street. But then we often will like kind of create together a script of like
Hmm.
how we can talk about it. And actually, like one of the best things I've discovered with doing that is we can often use, as long as the partner knows they're in therapy, is like, what if we use that as the launching point? I was talking to Jess about this, and here's what we came up with. So it's kind of like it just allows a softer landing to do a difficult conversation or an important kind of conversation to have with the partner.
Hmm.
But I mean, on any level, that's advice. Like, let's do this. Like, even me prepping them, like, that is you should do this. This is how we should do this.
I mean, the number of eye rolls I get with that "have you talked to them" question, oh my gosh. The number of eye
Right.
rolls I give myself because in the back of my own head I hear me saying, "Have you told them?" I'm like, "Oh God, how irritating." So anyone listening who's ever worked with me in a therapeutic capacity, I know how annoying I am.
But it also is a very important challenge
Yeah.
because how many times do we say the very things that we need to tell someone significant in our life?
Mm.
We'll tell all of that stuff to someone else
Yep.
because it's safer, or we can get someone on our side, or but we're actually not having that communication with the person that we need to.
Hmm.
So by having that challenge, it's kind of the questions implied about why aren't you? I think it's a really good one. Actually, I know it can have eye rolls because it's like, dang, you caught me. But at the
Uh-huh.
same time, it's also very important, I think.
I mean, I think often if there's an eye roll, there's something there.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
I really liked that phrase you used, clean our own side of the street. I've heard you use it before, but it sinks in this context really well, and it's a good way to kind of approach like, obviously there's more than one person in any relationship.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so that yeah is a helpful perspective to take.
I think so.
Yeah.
Thinking about time, Ryan, and I think what I'm struck with is that anyone listening to this probably realizes just how much we care and how much is going on in our heads when we are listening to clients. That it's a real balancing act between being completely in their narrative without having the drop down menus, as you
Mhm.
say, but also keeping in mind history and all of those things and what with affect, might be the important thing to say in this moment. And that all of that is intentionally, in my opinion, so much better than any advice we can give. Because a well thought out reflection or repetition or question can have such an impact in a way that me just telling you something can almost feel much more one dimensional.
Absolutely, yeah. It is really why clients would come to therapy instead of just talking to a friend. That's what we've been going to school for.
Mhm.
Understand the theory and the background, but most importantly is really how do you listen, how do you follow, how do you stay with a client, and then practice it for thousands of hours to turn it into an art form. Um, and that I think for me is like that's why I encourage new therapists, long-term colleagues, and myself like, hey, like don't let go of some of these basics, because they really are what frame the field, and they make us be better than rote advice that you
Yeah.
can Google. Yeah.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, Jess. And thank you for listening to Your Therapist Is Not Okay.
Yeah, we'll see you next time. And as always, ask us questions. We're here to answer them. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, check out our others. And stay tuned for even more episodes coming up.
Follow us and leave a review on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And please tell your friends.
You can also follow us on Instagram too at Your Therapist Is Not Okay. Also, if you have any questions that you want us to answer, send us a DM there. We would love to answer your questions. And a lot of our topics come from listeners just like you.